My name is Ben Schiller. I am a longtime Lincoln resident and an academic economist. I heard that the town's option C might severely underestimate the increase in housing units, so I decided to investigate myself. The problem arises due to a deficiency in the state compliance model, which excessively penalizes wetlands. Several mistakes and poor choices in the parcels included in option C dramatically exacerbates the problem. Let me explain. The HCA requires Lincoln to rezone that would allow 642 units to be built on the rezoned parcels. To understand how we would get to this number, let's dig into the compliance model. So let's take a given parcel, and we want to know how many units that parcel counts for towards the 642. Well, if we were to rezone that parcel to 15 units per acre and say, to keep things simple, that the parcel is 1 acre large, then that would allow 15 units to be on that parcel. But wait a second. What if that parcel has a lot of wetlands or other things that would restrict building? Okay, let's draw those wetlands. In that case, the state is not going to give us full credit for those 15 units. Rather, it has a model that would determine how many units could be built on the remaining portion of this land. If that model is a good model, then it would accurately portray the number of units that could be built on that parcel. However, if the modeled units are far less than the number that can actually be built, say due to flawed assumptions, then we may end up with far more than 642 units in the rezoned area. Option C appears to include many parcels where this concern is realized, which could have been avoided by choosing different parcels. Let me explain in more detail why this arises in the worksheet provided by the state and used by UTIL to design Option C. The state presumably wanted to ensure that towns didn't choose to rezone undevelopable areas, such as those 100% wetlands. So they came up with a very crude model to estimate the number of compliant units that could be built in one parcel. The state provides a worksheet which the town of Lincoln and UTIL use to calculate compliance. The formulas that I describe next are inferred from this worksheet. Start with the number of acres in a parcel, then remove the wetland acreage, then remove 20% of the entire parcel areas, including wetlands, as, quote, free space. Then remove 45% of the remaining acreage for parking, which seems odd given the claims that the spirit of the law is to encourage public transit. The compliance model assumes the remaining space can then be developed. The developable area in square feet is then divided by 1,000 square feet per apartment and then multiplied by 3, which is the number of stories that can be built. This is called the modeled units. The compliance model then compares the modeled units with the town-imposed restrictions on the density. For example, if the proposal restricted density to 20 units per acre, then no more than 40 units could be built on a 2-acre plot. The number of units that count towards compliance is the minimum of these two measures, that is, of the modeled units and the units according to the town-imposed density restrictions. The compliance model's failure stems from the first part, removing 20% of the entire parcel as free space. Why should 20% of a parcel be removed for things like setbacks and lawns if only a small fraction of the parcel is not wetlands that can be developed? It would seem to make more sense to remove 20% of the buildable non-wetlands part, rather than the entire parcel. But that is not what the compliance model does, which is why the compliance model underestimates buildable space on parcels with wetlands. The modeled units do not imply any restrictions on developers. The compliance model might suggest only 10 units could be built on a 4-acre plot due to the compliance model's shortcomings. However, if the town-imposed density were 15 units per acre, the developer could try to build 15 times 4, or 60 units, on that 4-acre parcel, so long as those 60 units are placed on the non-wetlands part. Consider an extreme example. Ryan Estates was included as one of the parcels in Option C. However, Ryan Estates is on a parcel that is over 80% wetlands. So after removing over 80% of the acres for wetlands, and another 20% of the entire parcel, including wetlands, for free space, these adding up to 100%, then there is no buildable area left, at least according to the state compliance model. Thus, including it among the parcels in option C counts as 0 housing units towards the 640 we need to rezone for. Yet Ryan Estates is clearly buildable. It has already been built up. In fact, there are currently 24 housing units on that parcel of land, demonstrating the deficiencies of the state compliance model. Consider another example, Lincoln Woods. Due to the model's flaws, it only counts as 159 units towards compliance. But the stated density restrictions for it in option C would allow 403 units to be developed. This highlights the crux of the problem. Option C was riddled with parcels that had substantial wetlands and town-owned lands, parcels which count very little towards our compliance, but that could be substantially developed. Okay, so if we look at the spreadsheet that was provided by the state and that UTIL used to help the town of Lincoln come up with the proposal, we can see which properties cause an issue and which don't. Let's go back to the spreadsheet and formula. The formula shows that the number of units counting towards compliance is the minimum of the modeled units and density units. The modeled units is the number of units the state believes could fit on non-wetlands based on its severely flawed model. That number, which is shown in the leftmost red column, is binding for the HCA compliance, but does not restrict in any way the number of units that can actually be built. The second number is the dwelling units per acre limit, i.e., the units that can legally be built based on the zoning restrictions. It simply equals the density per acre multiplied by the entire parcel acres, including wetlands. Given the state's model's flaws, this latter measure, the amount allowed by zoning, should be viewed as closer to the number of units that can actually be built. So if you start by looking at this top row here, which is 10 Lewis Street. So in this case, this property is fine. The actually stated limit in our HCA proposal will be what's binding and what will limit it. So we'll only have 7 units on this property, just as the proposal assumes. However, if you scroll down, let's say to Ryan Estates at 140 Lincoln Road, you can see that the modeled capacity, for reasons I described earlier, are 0. And that is what leads to this problem. We're only counting 0 of those units towards the compliance. I created a more realistic estimate by making one small change to the state model, assuming that rather than having 20% of the entire parcel removed as free space, that we remove only 20% of non-wetland areas. I also assumed that town land included in the rezoning would be developable, since there would be no reason to include them in the proposal unless they plan to develop them. After all, they provide 0 units in the compliance model. With these more reasonable assumptions, I find that developers could easily develop 1,119 units, increasing the housing units in Lincoln by roughly 50%, all in one small area, far more units than can be handled with existing infrastructure like roads. Yet 1,119 may still be too small. The number of units could be even larger if a developer were to buy up multiple parcels and combine them. My model suggests that 69 units could fit on dry lands on Ryan Estates, whereas the density restrictions would allow up to 142 housing units. This would seem to imply that 73 units could not be built due to limited dry lands on the parcel. However, these remaining 73 units could be further added to neighboring parcels if those parcels were combined and the undeveloped wetlands on Ryan Estates are used to water down the density in this combined parcel. Redoing the calculations after combining the parcels in each district, I find wetlands are no longer restrictive except for the district comprised of Lincoln Woods. Thus, if parcels within each district are combined, the total developed units could reach 1,326. Keep in mind that according to state-provided assessor data, there are only 2,078 housing units in all of Lincoln. So adding over 1,000 units to one small part of Lincoln would have large impacts. But wait, there's more. I suspect we may not have to rezone for 640 units. The Housing Choice Act caps rezoned units to 25% of existing housing units. If we exclude Hanscom, this amounts to 520 housing units for Lincoln. If Hanscom should be included, then why can't we just rezone Hanscom as part of our proposal? Presumably, that's not allowed. But then we should only have to rezone for 520 units. I should mention that we have the right to almost exclusively rezone existing multifamily properties. The law is designed to give credit to towns which have already built such housing. It seemingly is not meant to punish towns who have already made efforts to increase housing via denser apartments. That is presumably why it only called for rezoning rather than actual development. Given that over 40% of Lincoln's housing units are multifamily, we could legally comply without rezoning much for new development. Overall, I have many concerns about our existing proposals to comply with the Housing Choice Act. The proposals risk far more development than I believe our town can handle. I am confused about why we should rezone in a way that could lead to 1,326 units in the rezoned area, an increase of about 1,100, when we could fully comply with the law and its intentions by rezoning for 520 units, an increase of only about 350 units over parcels currently in option C. Said another way, why rezone for units equal to 64% of existing units in Lincoln rather than for a more reasonable increase in housing units in Lincoln? Overall, I think there are better ways to fully comply with the Housing Choice Act. I think we can do much better while adhering to the law and its intentions. Then, additional development can happen on our terms, thus ensuring our goals of more affordable housing units and environmental protections are met. I end with several questions for the town. First, how can we prevent development beyond levels stated by our compliance model? Can we cap development in one parcel to modeled units rather than stated density? Does this violate the Housing Choice Act? What is the rationale for including parcels that count 0 units towards compliance? Can we cap those parcels to 0 additional units? Would spreading development across different areas help choose parcels where overbuilding is less of a concern? Thank you for listening.